Hello, I'm Liz Wishnick from CNA and Columbia University's Weatherhead East Asian Institute. It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to this dialogue, the fifth in our series called Breaking New Ice, looking at the perspectives of U.S. Indo-Pacific partners on the Arctic. Today, last but not least, we address Japan. And to help us with this interesting topic, we have three excellent speakers. And I'm going to introduce each one very briefly before they start talking. They will each speak for up to about 8 minutes, and then we will turn to the Q&A portion of this first hour. And I urge you to think of your questions and write them in the Q&A box. But first, I want to thank Troy Bouffard, who has been our Zoom master all these weeks and made everything run smoothly in all these dialogues in multiple time zones. Dr. Troy Bouffard from the University of Alaska Fairbanks Center for Arctic Security and Resilience, and Dr. Cameron Carlson, Dean of the School of Business. And I would also like to give great thanks to Nicholas Hamasevich, who directs the RICE program at the East-West Center that has generously funded this initiative, and Zoe Weaver, who has been at the helm of communications for all of these events. So sincere thanks to all of you. And also, I'd like to point out that the East-West Center has been involved in this topic for some years under the leadership of former President Charles Morrison, who directs the North Pacific Arctic Initiative, which holds annual conferences with the Korea Maritime Institute and produces relevant writings on the topic. So this is following a long East-West Center tradition here. So let us begin. Our first speaker, and thank him for staying up late in the north of England, is Dr. James D.J. Brown, Professor of Political Science at Temple University in Japan. And the full bios of all the speakers are on the website. I don't want to take up everyone's time by listing all of their multiple accomplishments. So Dr. Brown, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and a real pleasure to be joining this event. So my focus is very much on Japan's relations with Russia. So that's what I'll concentrate on my initial comments. First of all, saying a few things to do with Japan's response to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine when it comes to Russia, and then also a bit about the prospects for this relationship going forward, because clearly for Japan's involvement with the Arctic, a lot of that will depend on its relationship with Russia. So the first point then, Japan's response, Japan's policy towards Russia since the start of the full-scale invasion, I think it caught a lot of people by surprise by just how forthright it was, given that under the previous Abe administration, that it had been a much more positive policy towards Russia. After the annexation of Crimea, Japan did introduce some sanctions, but they were deliberately calibrated to be very weak, to ensure that it didn't derail Abe's broader goal of improving relations with Russia. So given that there had been this background of many years of the Japanese government being really quite conciliatory towards Moscow, I think there was some surprise when the Kishida administration was so strong in the sanctions that they introduced, in their commitment to cutting imports of oil and coal, LNG a different matter, but then also with their very strong support for Ukraine, providing generous financial support also providing military aid, albeit not any weapons, and breaking new ground in some other areas as well, including a commitment to provide Patriot missiles produced within Japan to the United States in order to backfill some of the weaponry sent to Ukraine. Okay, so that's the initial point, that it's been quite a forthright, tough response. But yet, something which might not have been noted by observers more broadly is that to an extent, Japan has been quietly keeping the door open to a certain level of engagement with Russia. So this certainly does involve the energy area that I know some of our other speakers will be addressing later on. It also has included Japan retaining within the cabinet the position of Minister for Economic Cooperation with Russia. That's still there. But also some movements this year in order to try and restart a certain level of engagement. So Ambassador Muto, the Japanese ambassador in Moscow, earlier this year announced that Japan would be restarting educational and cultural exchanges. And at the moment within Japan, there's an official Russian festival of culture, which is taking place. There's also been strong indications from Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs of a desire to restart talks with Russia at a vice ministerial level, specifically because Japan wants to restart visa-free visits for former residents of the disputed Northern Territories. And also in June of this year, there actually was a Japanese diplomat, the head of their European Affairs Bureau, who traveled to Moscow and held some talks with a senior Russian diplomat. So if you look at all of that, maybe some people would wonder, well, is it possible that Japan could restart engagement with Russia in the near future? And my answer to that is no. Despite this interest from Japan in a certain level of engagement, a real priority of the government in Tokyo is to keep close to G7 partners. Now, that doesn't mean that Japan's policy towards Russia will be exactly the same, but it needs to avoid there being too much distance. So that means that whenever the G7 adds new measures against Russia, there's a sense within Tokyo that Japan needs to at least consider doing the same thing. So that means that Japan's policy will gradually be ratcheted up. And a recent example of that is to do with the use of the interest on the frozen assets. It's pretty clear that Tokyo was one of the more hesitant members about doing this, but it seems that they are going along with it, and Japan will be part of that. Okay, so that's one reason why I don't see any prospect of a major kind of change in Japan's policy, and that relations will remain largely frozen. The second one is Russia's determination to punish Japan for the steps that it has taken so far. So we see this in some really very aggressive rhetoric from Russian officials. If you look at the Russian media, you see a lot of name calling against the Kishida administration, a real attempt to demonize him and to paint him in a very negative light in comparison with Abe. There's been language about the Japanese supposedly supporting a Nazi regime for the second time in a century. And in particular, the official spokeswoman for Russia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Maria Zakharova, talking just this week about Japan's supposed warlike behavior and the need for Russia to take countermeasures. And if we look at some of the other retaliation that Russia has taken, there's been direct measures such as ending the peace talks between Japan and Russia to finally sign a peace treaty to officially kind of conclude the Second World War. Also this week, Russia introduced sanctions on 13 Japanese business leaders, including the heads of Toyota and Rakuten. Furthermore, we've had, I suppose you could see it as strategic retaliation. Part of the reason for Russia's engagement with North Korea that you will have noted is an effort to punish Japan for its closeness to the United States when it comes to the conflict in Ukraine. We've also seen some imaginative retaliation with all sorts of things, where Russia has just sought to introduce measures to annoy the Japanese side. This has included refurbishing a sort of derelict lighthouse, which is the closest point on the disputed islands to Japan. Also banning Japanese seafood, supposedly because of Russian concerns to do with wastewater being released from Fukushima. And furthermore, I think that as we look forward, there could be the risk of additional steps taken by Russia. So I wonder if we might see in the coming months, for instance, Japanese fishing boats being taken captive, supposedly because of violations of Russian waters, but really as a way to punish Japan for its policy. Also, we've seen sabotage incidents in Europe. Is the possibility that that could come to Japan as well? And furthermore, there have been increased cyber attacks coming from Russia against Japan over the last couple of years. It's possible that that will be ratcheted up as well. So overall, my conclusion is that even though Japan has kept the door open to a certain extent for some engagement, some dialogue, I don't see Japan-Russia relations coming out of the deep freeze anytime soon. And in fact, they could become even worse. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Dr. Brown. That was very informative, as we don't pay enough attention to this relationship. But why are we focusing on Japan-Russia ties here? I just want to give a little backstory before I introduce our next speaker. So I'm preparing a study for the East-West Center on how U.S. Indo-Pacific partners view the Arctic and what this means for the U.S. And in my research, what I've found so far, this research report will be launched on August 6th, I'll have you know, in Washington. But as I'm completing it, one interesting finding is that Russia looms large for these countries, especially for Japan, South Korea, and India, and to a lesser extent Singapore, but also for Singapore. And that's because they look at the Arctic from a different geographic perspective, and Russia is the gateway to the Arctic for them. And so the relationship with Russia has been very important to their ability to work there, to travel on the Northern Sea route, to participate in shipping, to receive energy, and so on. Now, Japan is probably closest to the U.S. in its concern about China-Russia collaboration, at least it's stating that publicly in some discussions with NATO recently, for example. And Japan also has had a long history in the Arctic, scientific expeditions dating back to 1957, participation in various initiatives on the Northern Sea route since the 1990s, and outlining an Arctic policy in 2015, and then further defining Arctic interests through a series of ocean policies, the most recent covering the 2023 to 2028 period. And Japan's Arctic policy highlights the importance of scientific research, of sustainable development and maritime governance, and also international cooperation and security. And so the relationship with Russia had been important in all of these spheres in terms of cooperation in scientific research, in terms of the energy the energy projects that we're going to hear about in a moment, and as a partner in the Arctic, in addition to the other Arctic states. That's because Japan, like the other partners I'm studying, is a member as an observer of the Arctic Council. So now let's look at the energy piece, because energy security, of course, is a key concern for Japan, meaning needing to import all of its LNG, and Russia is conveniently nearby. But let's hear from Shoichi Itoh, who is an energy expert from the Institute of Energy Economics, Japan, senior fellow at that institute, and has covered this issue for many years. So Shoichi, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Liz. And first of all, I'd like to express my deepest gratitude for everyone who prepared for this event. I'm so honored to be a part of this event with such excellent uh, uh, distinguished speakers. Well, now Japan reservation in Arctic as thought under the Western sanctions. I cannot agree with Dr. James Brown's excellent remarks more. She covered almost everything. But let me review a general picture of what happened to the bilateral energy link in recent years to understand its potential limits are reduced as costs in the sector. In retrospect, it is unbelievable and ridiculous, I must say, frankly, that Japan tried to cling to one of Russia's two main Arctic energy projects, namely the Arctic LNG 2, until the very last minute when Japan was compelled to face the robust fact that Tokyo had to stand in line with Washington to increase sanctions against Russia just last November. Even after the outbreak of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, Tokyo excused itself for keeping stakes in the Arctic project along with the Sakhalin project in the name of energy security, actually without any grant at all. I must emphasize that Japanese energy security is completely safe without any additional LNG or liquefied natural gas supplies from Russia. Technically speaking, Japan's energy life is fine without Russian gas at all. The real picture is actually a bit complicated, so we can come back on this later if you'd like to. Japan's energy link with Russia in the Arctic was originally a product of ex-Prime Minister Abe's special tie with Vladimir Putin. At the time, the Arctic energy was placed as the flagship project of the bilateral cooperation then and badly remained so until recently. As a matter of fact, the Japanese side never had its own feasibility study of the project before making a final decision on massive investment in the project in the early 2020s. Such a bizarre case is quite unprecedented. It is very natural we should implement a robust economic feasibility study to evaluate investment risks when we make a decision on a big project, right? The Arctic LNG 2 was not such a case for Tokyo, unbelievably. The Japanese government even amended the law to enable its national organization to provide loan guarantees for the economically unproven political project for the purpose of attracting Putin's interests in striking a deal on Northern Territories issue. Tokyo's geopolitically naive calculation of approaching Russia against a backdrop of escalation of Sino-Japanese relations was also part of such a headlong commitment to the Arctic project. Russia had had hybrid strategies of developing northern sea route in the Arctic, including military and energy infrastructure Since early 2010s, Russia intends to become one of the major LNG suppliers in the drastically changing global gas market, triggered by the U.S. shale gas revolution that made America a growing LNG superpower. At the same time, it is also important to note that energy trade became Russia's vehicle to attract foreign investment in the consolidation of transport infrastructure along the northern sea route, which is actually dual use, until the eve of the European War, after which Russia had no alternative but to tilt all the way to China. Moscow could not hide its geopolitical concern about considerable overprojection of Chinese presence in the Arctic, even if the first Arctic project, Yamal Energy, was partly financed by Chinese oil company and banks, and Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping officially agreed to create synergy between Russia's northern sea route and China's polar Silk Road as a symbol of the bilateral cooperation in the Arctic. From a Russian perspective, energy cooperation with Japan was very useful because Japan's commitment not only helped financing Arctic energy too, which had massive investment risks, but also offset otherwise more conspicuous presence of China. Now, the stage is very different under the Ukraine war. Geopolitically and financially, Moscow needs to increase or even encourage China's more proactive involvement in the Arctic theater. Compared with the western routes between Yamal and Guiana peninsulas and Europe, where ice-breaking LNG carriers can operate by themselves year-round, the eastern route between those peninsulas and Asia is covered with thicker ice and technically more difficult to navigate, and thus entails much more economic costs. Every single LNG carrier still needs to be escorted by nuclear-powered icebreakers, pass through difficult points in the eastern routes, even in the midsummer when sea ice area is minimized. Then why is the eastern route of the northern series so important for Russia? It's because the eastern part is exactly the geographical range where transportation and the socio-economic infrastructures are less developed, and Moscow must intensively beef up for military purposes to stand against the United States. For the effective use of the eastern route in the Arctic, Russia has planned to increase the number of nuclear-powered icebreakers, although Russia already has numeric advantage vis-a-vis the United States. They have as many as 7 nuclear-powered icebreakers as of today. From the standpoint of US-Japan alliance, Japan's withdrawal from Arctic Energy 2 was indispensable, and Tokyo should have made the decision long before it was compelled to do so in order to follow the economic sanctions. To complete the blueprint of the Dutch Arctic Cooperation, Japanese investments could have been sourced into improvement of Russia's military infrastructure, including nuclear-powered icebreakers behind the scene. This is such a pity though. Tokyo simply wasted huge amounts of Japanese taxpayers' money for nothing in the end. Anyway, the series of Western sanctions have virtually killed the future of Arctic energy too so far. Russia initially hoped that Chinese companies could make up for technologies and services Russia had lost access to in the Western markets, but in vain. Increasing sanctions against the Russian LNG project have made the Chinese entities give up their engagement one after another in the Arctic LNG too. China has more stakes in two of the Russian energy projects in the Arctic than Japan, but it does not mean the Arctic is an important part of the globe for China's overall energy strategy. The combined total amount of energy China can expect to import from Russian projects is very negligible. Let me wrap up what I've said. Well, energy, more specifically energy, once became a symbol of Russia's link with Japan and China in the Arctic. Energy has lost importance as a Russian vehicle to attract foreign investment in the Arctic under the Ukraine war. But regardless of the Western sanctions, essentially, Russia's gas potential is never important, that much important for Asian buyers, if you know the energy market. Energy relations in the Arctic was largely politicized, and now such a scheme is dashed. Um, so far, that's all. Thank you very much uh, for your kind attention.
Thank you, Shoichi. That was a very interesting discussion of the politics of the energy investments and the geopolitical and other factors that push them forward despite the available evidence. So we're going to come back to some of the interesting points that you made later. But last but not least, we're so fortunate to have Dr. Sheila Smith, a longtime friend of the East-West Center and currently the John E. Merow Senior Fellow for Asia-Pacific Studies of the Council on Foreign Relations. And she's going to help us understand what all this means for the United States. So take it away, Sheila.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you, both Weatherhead Institute and East West Center for including me in this conversation. I will say at the get-go, when Liz reached out to me, I said, I know nothing about the Arctic. I don't even know if the United States and Japan are cooperating in any way. And so this is a little bit of homework for me, but it's been an interesting investigation for me. So James, Shoichi, and Liz, of course, are the true experts on this panel, but let me share a couple of impressions that I had digging in a little bit to both Japan's approach to the Arctic and our approach to the Arctic. These are not intersecting policies by any means. I think, as Liz pointed out in her introduction of Japan's approach, Japan really looks to the Arctic for engagement. It calls its approach the Arctic engagement policy, not a strategy or a vision. And as Liz noted, the October 2015 Arctic policy was the first articulation of that. It really comes out, again, from Japan's maritime ocean policy approach. And it was first mentioned, I think, in 2013 is what I could find in that ocean policy law or strategy that they put out every 5 years. You start to see the Arctic rise in the consciousness of this oceans policy. Again, sea routes, international cooperation, Liz pointed this out, and scientific research are largely the focal points of the Arctic approach and this strategy. The last one in 2023 I thought was interesting because there you really get a much more full-bodied articulation of the Arctic, of what the Japanese are focused on when they're looking at the Arctic. And it reflects what all of our previous speakers have described, both an increasing worry about, the environmental impacts of climate change and sea ice melt and the consequences of that, but also the navigational difficulties that I think Shoichi mentioned, but also this question of how the climate change is affecting increasing access to that central Arctic ocean. The other piece where Japan has come out rather strongly that you'll hear echoes of in its Arctic approach, of course, is the support for a rules-based international order. Japan is a very strong advocate of this across the board. And this is something that they're bringing to their Arctic policy, and where they see that Japan can in fact play a supporting role, both to the Arctic Council, as Liz mentioned, but also to other international organizations that may have increasing influence over the way in which the Arctic is governed. Here I'm thinking specifically about COAFA, which is the Central Arctic Fishing Agreement that has been really, I think, a trendsetter in terms of sustainable fishing agreements. Japan is very strongly in support of that approach to resources. So you've got this sort of Japanese approach that's largely scientific, largely maritime, largely multilateral norms-based approach. The United States, of course, has first and foremost a national security interest in the Arctic. We have our territory. We are an Arctic state of the 8. We are one of the 8 Arctic states. It is our homeland defense in which the Arctic is considered. And so I think it's an important distinction there. Two things that came up to me, and we're kind of lucky, or I felt kind of lucky, that the DoD just issued its Arctic strategy last week. So that came out with Secretary Austin's preamble to it. And I don't know that this is lucky, especially for those on the panel who are residents of Alaska. But just yesterday, the Chinese and Russians decided to have an intrusion into our ATIS with bombers and fighters. So there's a lot of national security focus on readiness and observation of not only Russian activities, of course, but also the increasing Chinese activities that you see across the Arctic. So in October 2022, the Biden administration presented their Arctic strategy. It's a national strategy, not simply the Homeland Defense piece, although that's a component of it, but like Japan, a focus on climate change and environmental impact of the changes, the rapid changes that are accelerating in the Arctic. It also focuses on economic development of the people of Alaska, including the indigenous peoples that are living largely in the coastal areas that align with the Arctic Sea. And of course, international cooperation and governance, another common thematic with Japan. But this DoD strategy is what I thought we'd talk just a little bit more about. You know, the language that Secretary Austin uses is that the Arctic has now become a venue for strategic competition. So very clearly, you see this framing of geopolitical great power competition there. Russians have always been a focal point of America in that part of the world and next to our territory. But clearly, this Russian-Chinese collaboration has many in the Pentagon and in the U.S. government worried. Finland and Sweden have now entered NATO. So, of course, the Arctic also engages the United States in its strategy in the NATO alliance as well. And that's something that I found very interesting in the DoD report, is this focus on these new Arctic states' arrival into the alliance structure that is led by the United States and Europe. And I think the piece of the puzzle that I think is important for DoD, and it's important for DoD across the Indo-Pacific and in other theaters as well, but is really significant, is having the U.S. military and security planners consider the environmental impact of climate change on not only what they need to focus attention on the behavior of other states, but also the actual missions themselves are deeply affected by climate change. And I thought that was an interesting piece. So if you have time to read the strategy, please do. It's not very long. But I think it's an important added piece. It's not simply what other states are doing, but the overall impact of climate change has national security implications also for the United States. So what does this have to do with the U.S.-Japan alliance? I'm not sure. I was telling Liz that I went to ask my friends in both governments who had prepared for Prime Minister Kishida's state visit to Washington in April, where, as many of you know, there was a joint statement that went on and on and on and on with over 70-something deliverables, right? Not one of which had to do with the Arctic that I could find anyway. So that's an interesting absence. But on both sides, I found the U.S. alliance managers sort of scratched their heads and looked at me and said, "The Arctic? Really? Why are you asking me about this?" And they cabled back to Tokyo and to try to figure out what in fact the respective ideas were coming out of different bureaus of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But there is, of course, Arctic strategy and policy in both capitals. The lack of intersection, though, I think is an interesting thing for us to talk about. And I'm sure, Liz, in your research is another piece of your thinking. You know, the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy is very focused on the Pacific and the Indian Oceans. But of course, the Bering Sea and the United States, the northern part of the Pacific is not often considered to be part of that framing. It's usually Southeast Asia and other parts looking south and looking west. China and Russia's behavior, of course, Japan knows this well, and James has written about this very, very thoughtfully. But, the Chinese and Russians are also exercising north of Japan. Their military collaboration in the northern seas, northern Pacific, is growing. And I think that's another set of patterns of behavior that the U.S. and Japan should be very careful to watch together and to think about together. Maritime cooperation is obviously a broad swath of U.S. policy as well as Japanese policy, but it does seem to me that whether it be climate change and environmental impact, whether it be fisheries management and conservation efforts, there's an awful lot of overlap there, non-military overlap in the interests of the United States and Japan that can be explored very well with using the Arctic example. And of course, this growing Indo-Pacific NATO conversation, as Liz pointed out, the NATO summit in Washington did have that dimension to it. There is increasing dialogue between our NATO partners and the 4 Asia-Pacific allies. That's Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand on issues of common concern and common interest. So this is, again, one of the few areas where we don't have something to say together, but we have an awful lot to say in these venues separately that may be we may be able to echo similar goals and norms. Couple of things I would say just to keep in mind as we look ahead, and that the Arctic case study, if you will, brings up for the Alliance is, I don't think we should underestimate the impact or the possibility of fisheries disputes. And here I'm thinking specifically of the Russian military firing on U.S. fishing vessels off of Alaska and in the Bering Sea. But of course, there's competition for marine resources, the Bering Sea, the Barents Sea, and the North Atlantic that all have to do with those Arctic states. And even the Europeans are also quite concerned about use of force incidents as well. I think the U.S. Homeland Defense mission is probably not somewhere where the Japanese will play a role. Given the nature of our bilateral security treaty, Japan does not have reciprocal obligations to defend the United States. It's unlike NATO, right? That doesn't mean that our militaries may not think about exercising and presence operations that might be of interest to them in the Northern Pacific, and certainly something to consider. And then finally, it's China, China, and more China. I mean, I think this is, I don't want to make China the bucket within which every issue has to fall. But clearly the coordination between China and Russia these days is increasingly linking different dimensions of security pressures on the United States specifically, on Japan specifically, but also on our alliance structure as well. So I think it behooves us to look at these linkages between NATO, European security, and the Ukrainian war has been mentioned several times, and the DPRK, Putin's visit to North Korea, Northeast Asia, and is now getting increasingly more important to Russia in terms of the way in which it thinks about how it's going to prosecute the war and who it's going to punish, as James said, for helping Ukraine. But I think there's a larger knitting together of strategic aims here that I suspect will also be quite visible in the Arctic as well. So let me stop there, Liz. It's a kind of a broad swath of issues that the US and Japan might think about intersecting a little bit more consciously as we think about the Arctic and our respective policies. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila. That was an excellent way of grappling with the absence of the Arctic. Sherlock Holmes' dog that is not barking is sometimes interesting too. So I would invite the audience to put their questions in the Q&A. And while you're thinking of your questions, I have a question for each of the panelists, and we will begin. So starting in our speaking order with James, you were talking about how Russia is punishing Japan for its sanctions, and yet Japan was one of the investors in Sakhalin and in these LNG projects, as Shoichi detailed. And if one goal that Russia has is to avoid excessive dependence on China, even as the partnership with China deepens, and to bring in additional partners into the Arctic, how do you think Russia balances these goals of punishing Japan versus having the additional Japanese investment, Japanese participation in these projects?
Thanks very much. So, I mean, the short answer is I don't think they really are balancing those interests anymore. That was the policy previously, and there was very clearly an active effort to try and avoid overdependence on China, to try and make sure that within big investments such as the Arctic LNG-2 project, that it wasn't just Chinese investment, but rather you have others, including the French, including the Japanese. But they've torpedoed their own strategy by invading Ukraine, by exacerbating tensions with the countries that have been supporting Ukraine. And so that's just not really a viable policy anymore. So yeah, Japan has held on to the stakes in the Sakhalin projects and with Arctic LNG-2, even though Japan's consortium still holds the stake. It's so clearly frozen. Nothing's going to happen there because of the US Treasury sanctions. So what we've got really is that that level of Japanese involvement, which is most importantly the LNG from Sakhalin-2, seems likely to remain for the time being, but it's never going to increase. And so for that reason, that initial goal for the Russians of avoiding Chinese overdependence on China, that's gone. They are now going to be increasingly overdependent on China.
Yeah, and they also burned their bridges with Korea, with South Korea, also was supposed to be an important player. The only country, well, there are other countries looking, like India has some interests that we heard about in a previous dialogue. And Russia has been engaging with UAE and Turkey and some other countries. So in terms of Russia, Japan, though, do you see the Arctic as an area where Japan has been trying to keep the door open as you began your remarks, or is this not really going to be one of those areas in the future?
No, it certainly was anyway. And when the Japanese government thinks about the Arctic, I mean, my impression is that a very, very large proportion of that is to do with energy related issues. So yeah, I think that up until the end of last year, there was still this hope, well, maybe, Arctic LNG-2 might still work out. But Shoichi said in what I think were excellent comments, it was just naive. The belief that in some way they could go from, not just retaining their imports of LNG from Sakhalin-2, but in that environment to actually increase substantially their imports, that was just never going to be seen as acceptable by other G7 partners. So yeah, I think they did try and maintain or even increase their level of cooperation with Russia on energy issues in the Arctic, but the US Treasury sunk that plan. And I think that it was a real miscalculation from Tokyo to think that increasing imports from the Russian Arctic was ever going to be acceptable.
Shoichi, continuing on this energy issue, you stated that it was very much wishful thinking for Japan to get involved in these LNG projects in hope that this would lead to some major opening in relations with Russia. Yet Japan claims that these projects are important to energy security, and especially to prevent China from coming in and taking over these investments. So do you think this China angle is a serious one, or is this meant to make the investments more palatable to other countries imposing sanctions?
Well, I think when we talk about the China factor, it's just a matter of the way to justify what they're doing. And as for the Sahan too, there actually exists a big concern that in case of Japan steps at the Sahan 2, China may come in to take Japan's stakes in the Sahan 2 project. It may be the case, but at the same time, we should forget that whatever decision or policy Japan may take, they might Russians may do it. So it's simply beyond our control. Of course, we don't need to abandon. We have invested in the sign too, without concrete, reasonable explanation. But at the same time, we should be reminded that even in case of losing stakes in the Saharan 2, Japan could theoretically, actually physically, obtain more than sufficient amount of energy from elsewhere. But at the point, we need to know that in case Japan procure LNG from elsewhere, it will simply boost international gas prices. So it's such a complicated picture. But technically speaking, Japan is still importing as much as about roughly 6 million tons of LNG from Saharan 2. And companies are going back and forth whether they renew their long-term contracts be after the early 2030s. They may or they may not, we'll see. But regardless of the decisions, Japanese energy security is quite safe, and we can purchase LNG sometimes more cheaply in the world. And so in the context, the increasing volumes of U.S. energy exports to the globe is really benefiting Japan and the other countries.
Yeah, that's very interesting that you said that Japan actually doesn't need this LNG, and it's just been.
Well, maybe it's too much to say Japan doesn't need. See, I'm saying that theoretically, Japan can secure its own energy life without, even in case Japan loses stakes in the Saharan 2. As I said, Japan, cannot just abandon the stakes without reasoning, and because we, we have no reason to. Japan has no reason to lose its own money. It's invested. In case it has to do it due to the escalation of the Ukraine war, Japan could still find backups easily.
So that's a very we don't often hear this argument about Japan, is that I know that Japan decreased the percentage of LNG it gets from Russia.
It's remained almost same. The demand for energy Japan import for energy still account for about 9% of the energy portfolio. It's because it's basically based upon long-term contract, and the Japanese companies are getting Russian energy rather cheaply. So we have replacement elsewhere in the world.
And is the U.S. trying to provide LNG as an alternative to?
Well, it's not the way, because the government cannot dictate the market. So it's everything goes in accordance with market dynamics. that it's clear that U.S. is steadily increasing the amount of LNG to the global gas market.
Hmm.
So is Qatar and Australia. Mhm.
Thank you. That's very interesting. So I see we have two questions. I'm going to get to them. I just have one last question for Sheila, and then we'll turn to our audience. So Sheila, you made a number of interesting points about the U.S. and Japan in the Arctic, and your conclusion that Japan and the U.S. don't really discuss the Arctic, despite a very robust partnership. So why do you think that is? Do you think that has to do with the siloed nature of the State Department, where we look at the Indo-Pacific, we look at Europe, and somehow Arctic falls through the cracks? Or what was your explanation for this lack of?
So just to be clear, I did not go to all bureaus of the State Department to ask my question. And I think that's maybe partly where we might find the answer, if I can put it that way. So I asked the US-Japan alliance managers, and that's who scratched their head. It was not on the agenda. And as you know, when we have these big state visits, it's the time for all kinds of things. The Artemis, trip to Mars, or all kinds of US-Japan cooperation that goes on across our whole of government, right? So whether it's environmental issues, space exploration, all kinds of things that we do that don't fall under our typical US-Japan alliance thinking process, right? And those come to light during state visits, right? So that's why you had that long list of everything the US and Japan were doing together today, most of which had nothing to do with national security. But that's why I was surprised when I didn't find it. So for me, I think where we would find it would be in the bureaus that manage. I know there's a question in the chat about extended continental shelf claims. That's not going to be in the East Asia Bureau. That's going to be somewhere else. But I think you will find it in different pockets of our multilateral global governance experts in diplomats. So I suspect that's really where we overlap in our positions. I don't know, and I would have to do a much deeper dive than what I did to prepare for tonight to see whether or not there actually are conflicting points of view on some of these issues. Now, one of the things, again, the fisheries disputes, it's not necessarily a conflicting point of view, but it's just going to rest on Japan and the United States differently. We may both, US and Japan, have issue with Russian fisheries enforcement, be it northern Japan or northern Pacific writ large, and including our coast of Alaska, off Alaska. But that doesn't mean we're going to respond jointly, right, to those things. We will respond with our own law enforcement, or if necessary, right, obviously. The militaries, I don't think the militaries, our military or the Japanese military, would want to go anywhere near a fisheries dispute. The Russians don't have apparently that limitation, nor do the North Koreans for that matter, and other actors as well. But our Coast Guard, the place I would, if I was going to do a iteration number 2 of this, given my, kind of over the surface look at the relationship, I would go to the law enforcement and Coast Guard. And I would go to fisheries management and also law of the sea. And that's where the continental shelf question, I think, is really quite interesting. We may not have similar interests in that, under the UNCLOS there, because as you know, Japan does not take that position vis-a-vis continental shelf delineations when it comes to its neighbor on the other side, China. So we may have different points of view on some of these multilateral governance issues that would be fun to explore. I'm not sure I answered your question, but that's kind of how I would see it.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I did go to some of the Arctic folks in the State Department, and
you?
I
Yeah.
asked them about engaging with Indo-Pacific countries, and they said, that might be a problem for the Arctic 7.
Yeah.
There's a norm in the Arctic that that the emphasis should be on Arctic states.
Yeah.
And the objection to China's great fanfare with its Arctic white paper and all that was that it claimed to be a near Arctic state, even though it was near the Arctic. And so there's that hesitation, I think, to.
And that's
so
supporting. Yeah, I mean, others who are Arctic specialists should jump in here, but that supporting role for the Arctic Council is largely a we'll support you in your multilateral effort to develop this new regime of global governance, right? Be it again conservation or managing the impact of climate change, or but we're not necessarily going to get into your business. And I think that's one of the unspoken pieces of the puzzle for the Arctic that may be different than other types of multilateral institutions where everybody should join if people want more participation. But as you say, this is a tricky one because of China's not so welcome participation.
So we have a couple of questions here. One is from Cornell Overfield, my colleague at CNA, and he's asking about international law.
Yeah.
And is there any reaction in Japan to Russia's what he calls legal innovations for control along the Northern Sea route? And what he means is Russia claims under UNCLOS 234 that this is an ice-covered waterway, and Russia has the right to regulate it, to charge fees, and to demand its own icebreakers take the lead. So do any of you want to comment on that? What is Japan's response to that? James, go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick response, really, which is that I follow very closely pretty much anything that the Japanese government says to do with Russia. And I think it's very interesting that unless I've somehow missed it, I've not seen anything from a Japanese government official commenting on this. And it would be something that in some ways you would expect that they would. The fact that they seem to have said nothing on Russia's attempts to present the Northern Sea route as being very much Russian waters, I think that says something about Japan's priorities when it comes to the Arctic. I read into that their priority has been the energy from this region rather than seeing for them the Northern Sea route as a particularly important transit route. And so maybe that explains why they haven't made this that much of a priority.
Can I add a little comment that
Sure.
just again, James is the expert here on this piece of the Japan-Russia relationship. What struck me, I read the fourth ocean policy, just very briefly in preparation for this. It's only in Japanese, so it hasn't been translated yet. So again, I was reading it in Japanese, so I would have to go back to make sure I'm absolutely right on this. But what they did point out in that ocean policy was that they were interested in freedom of navigation. And so that may be an indirect response to an attempt to claim particular rights, but it was specific to the Arctic. Now, I don't think you're going to find the Japanese military out demonstrating, doing freedom of navigation operations the way the U.S. military does, but that principle was front and center under the new ocean policy law. I thought was just interesting, and maybe there, James, there might be a connection to Russian assertions. I don't know.
I did find one article from a researcher for the House of Councilors talking about how this was a contradiction, that Japan wants an open, Indo-Pacific and maritime environment, and yet to participate in the NSR, you would have to accept some of these rules that are contrary to it. But the author didn't really conclude.
No further.
Right. And I think it's true, maybe Shoichi could say something about this, that Japanese companies are still rather hesitant about the shipping part of the NSR, and the conditions really haven't been that conducive apart from LNG shipping.
Well, it's such a great question. It's really a good, part of the background of the Arctic LNG truth, mysterious, backgrounds, as I explained. Well, according to Russian law, all cargoes, vessels need to follow Russian rules. And so this is exactly the point that although Japan finally abandoned Arctic Energy too, when it comes to the real point for realization, which never come to anyway, they had to dive into the specific legal issue we are talking about. Because as for the northern sea routes, including the eastern routes, in case of contingencies or accident, only Russians can come up and provide rescue activities just like that. And so all the legal details have remained quite cloudy and unclear. And but as far as foreign vessels, including Japanese, use northern sea routes, they have to accept Russian order unconditionally.
Hmm.
Of course, it does make conflict with international law. So when it comes to the details, actually Tokyo didn't think it's over very seriously. Mhm.
Right. So Japan would have to accept Russian rescue or wait for Russian rescue in case of an accident in that scenario.
Mhm.
The other part of this question is, what is Japan's position on the continental shelf? And has Japan taken a position or affirmed the U.S. right to a full continental shelf? Has anyone studied this issue? We might need to check our law books about that one.
Yes.
So
Liz, can I bring up something related to Shoichi's answer to your
sure,
question?
sure.
So, and this is James too, I guess I'd like to hear what your thought is. But so under UNCLOS, I think it's Article 37, there's the right of transit through straits, peaceful, and there's the right of innocent passage, right? So straits passage across the Arctic has been accepted, I believe, right? And I don't know how that relates to the Northern Sea route, but it is largely a commercial function, right? And as long as you are moving through expeditiously, you are allowed to transit straits, and it includes the Arctic straits. But Russia earlier this year, James, announced, so it reneged on the right of innocent passage around Crimea, right? Last, I don't know how many years, 2 years or so ago, but it just announced a similar thing in the northern area as well. So it basically says we will not acknowledge the right of innocent passage through the Kurils or north of, right, Japan. And I was just wondering, this encroachment by Russia on UNCLOS norms, right, seems to be a fairly consistent effort to undermine and maybe control, in the case of the Arctic, access to sea routes and especially the straits themselves. Does anybody, James, did you notice that that statement by Putin, by the government of Russia on the Northern Territories waters?
Yeah, so that to do with the waters around the southern Kurils from the Russian point of view, what they specifically did is that in a technical way, they suspended the right of innocent passage for all ships that are non-Russian flagged. And they did it in quite an interesting way. They did it first of all for a brief period of time, then they extended it once, then they extended it again, but then it actually ended.
Oh, it
So
ended.
I
Okay.
think
Didn't
your
realize that.
use of the term kind of encroachment is exactly
Mhm.
right, that they're maybe chipping away at it, exploring what the response might be,
Yeah.
but without fully abandoning it. So I think that that's something definitely to watch.
To watch, yeah. Did you, and I didn't see any I went to look for a Japanese response, but saw none. So this gets to your question about Japanese response to some of these Russian, interpretations, let's say, of UNCLOS.
I mean, there was some stuff in the Japanese media on that when they were reporting it, in particular Hokkaido Shimbun, which follows these things very closely. They asked Japanese officials, "What do you think's going on here?" And the response from the anonymous Japanese officials was, "Frankly, we've got no idea. We don't think it's to do with just military exercises, because Russia regularly has military exercises in the area, and they don't suspend right of innocent passage for such a huge kind of area." So it did seem to be something very new, and I interpreted it as being part of this broader way of just trying to do things that are as annoying as possible against the Japanese.
But they had done it in Crimea as well. I mean, so it does, and maybe the Arctic edition here might be something to take a closer look at. Sorry, Liz, I didn't want to go into too much detail, but it seems like an interesting angle of what the Russians are trying to do.
It is interesting, and Russia and its foreign policy concept talks about how it wants to engage with friendly countries in the Arctic and potentially bring in more outsiders, BRICS countries, and potentially create some new norms in the region. Although when China tries to act independently, Russia reacts. So there was a research vessel from China that forayed into an area just outside of the Russian zone of regulation, and Russia was not happy about that. So I think Russia's taking a very complicated line there. But we do have more questions, and one is about the environment. We have someone joining us from Ghana, so welcome. Interested that you're following Arctic issues, and he asks, how can we assess the damage to the marine ecosystems due to Russia-Japan interactions or lack thereof? Is the environment an issue where Japan and Russia have engaged, or yes?
One thing comes to mind in this area. It's a little bit indirect, but it comes from the 1990s, actually. In 1993, Russia and Japan signed an agreement which was all about Japan helping Russia to dispose of nuclear waste. There was a concern right at the beginning of the 1990s that decrepit Russian nuclear subs were leaking low-level nuclear waste into the Sea of Japan. And so this agreement was made, which was for Japan to provide assistance to dispose of some of this material, and that would be to the benefit of everyone. And last year, I think it was in November 2023, Russia unilaterally withdrew from that agreement, clearly as a result of the broader deterioration of relations. So that, on the surface, looks like it's bad for the environment in the region as a consequence of these political tensions. But actually, that agreement had become pretty much dead letter. I don't think there was any real cooperation that was still going on in that area. So on the issue of what the environmental consequences have been of the rift between Russia and Japan, I don't immediately see any major consequences, but perhaps I'm overlooking something.
I don't see anything other. Sorry, I think you're perfectly right. And first, the Japan-Russia link has caused no damage in the Arctic so far. In this respect, luckily, the project is naturally. Number two, basically, this is just fundamental. I don't think Russia is really seriously interested in ecosystem.
Yeah.
Number three, when they talk about environmental problem, it is only the time they can manipulate or politically weaponize the issue for non-environmental purpose. Yeah.
Yeah, I do think that there's a considerable amount of research that scientists from Japan and Russia have been engaging in about various environmental issues. And to my knowledge, the cooperation goes on to some extent. I mean, the activities of the Arctic Council were suspended, but some working groups are proceeding. And I think it's likely, especially as James has been expressing the desire to maintain exchanges, that some scientific cooperation is ongoing. So that's one area where we might still see some attention to environmental issues. Though Japan has been teaming up with China to be accusing Japan of environmental abuses because of the Fukushima issue. So it's become highly politicized as well.